What does Katharine Hepburn, Humphrey Bogart and the movie The African Queen have to do with Mimi and Toutou? Well, stick around, you might just find this interesting. Hello, my name is Stephen Burnett and I'd like to introduce you to another episode of Storytime for Grown-Ups. This week I'd like to talk about a couple of characters called Mimi and Toutou, but first let's cast our mind back to the First World War, which happened between 1914 and 1918, mostly in Europe. But there was a second part to the World War, and Germany and Britain were fighting for domination of East Africa, a very important part of the African continent. At that time, there were several European nations looking for control of Africa. Belgium had its Congo, Portugal had a vast resource there, Britain certainly in Germany, and they were after cotton, mining, diamonds, rubber extracted through the terrible slave trade that was prevalent at that time. This region is the Rift Valley of Africa, and it contains the Great Lakes. Tanzania, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Albert, Lake Victoria, Lake Kivu, and Lake Malawi. Vast tracts of water surrounded by land, of course. The British influence centered in Kenya, the German influence centered in Tanzania or Tanganyika, but whoever controlled Lake Tanganyika really controlled the eastern part of Africa. Von Lettow, the German brilliant tactician, had figured out that it was easier to move large numbers of men by water than it was over land, and the end of that discussion was who controls the lakes controls the landmass. In 1841, Germany established their colony and dominated 13,000 square miles of Lake Tanganyika, which is where the story of Mimi and Toutou going forth really took place, and how the entire story about this remarkable escapade came into being. While all of this was happening, a big game hunter called John Lee, who'd been living in the region for many years, decided to travel back to Britain and alert the UK to what was happening. He was a pretty forceful character and managed to get an audience with Winston Churchill and explain how domination of the lake would essentially be domination of the East African Rift Valley. The upshot of this was that Winston Churchill appointed a lieutenant called Spicer Simpson, who had not been exactly the most inspirational officer in the Royal Navy, but he thought it might be suitable for him to travel out to East Africa and resolve this dilemma. That was only part of the plan. The most bold part of the plan concerned Mimi and Toutou. These were the names of two fast attack boats that the Brits decided to build at the Thornycroft Yard on the Thames, with two 100 horsepower engines in each of them, and a Maxim machine gun and a 3-pounder cannon would be mounted at the front of each of these boats. Winston Churchill also assembled a team from the Royal Naval Reserve, including an ex-travel agent from Thomas Cook, a former Grand Prix car driver, several gunners, mechanics, planners, and several support staff, very few of whom had been out of Britain before and were absolutely astounded at the thought of traveling to Africa. The little mini-ships were named Mimi and Toutou by Spicer Simpson, and the plan was to ship them on board the Landennis Castle in the UK and box them in square cradles to disguise what they really were. The Landennis Castle was a lovely passenger ship, and the little boats were truly boxed and stowed away on deck. The typical colonial outfitting of the day, of course, included the British Worcestershire sauce, lots of mosquito netting, trinkets for the natives, and some trading goods that they were able to smuggle inside the boat. They started on this 8,000-mile trek from Britain by traveling to Cape Town, where the boats were unloaded onto railway flat cars and then lashed down in preparation for the journey north. This trip north was the most extraordinary journey for all of the party. They were on open rail cars. A few of the officers managed to stay inside as the train, which was pretty slow at that time, cranked its way north from Cape Town rather, in the direction of Johannesburg. It wasn't traveling more than 30 miles an hour, so plenty of time to relax and try and prepare their thinking for the arrival at the railhead. As they went past Bulawayo, a little bit of game certainly started to appear. And of course, at Victoria Falls, as I've mentioned before, everyone got out to take a look at Museo Tunye, this fantastic waterfall. Back on the wagons, the food was not that good, but across the veldt, through what we now know as Zambia, going further north still, to the extent of the rail line close to Lumumbashi. At this point, the road ahead was extremely difficult. They had rocks to blast out of the way. They had forests to clear a path through. There were gullies they had to fill with tree trunks to try and make a makeshift bridge. This was real work as they hacked a path through the so-called jungle and pulled and dragged Mimi and Toutou across country. Once they were off the rail cars, they were really manhandling these two mini warboats. They tried to pull them along with the traction engines, which more or less worked, but at times they needed the help of as many as 40 oxen lashed to the front of the traction engines to give them additional pull. When that didn't work, they had to resort to cabling and winching, where they attached the front of the traction engines to a series of trees in the forest, and they literally winched the warboats from one plantation to another. This was extremely difficult. They were fighting bilharzia, they were fighting malaria, and several other insect-borne diseases, and all the time locals were coming out from the villages and absolutely staring at them as they passed by. Eventually, they arrived August the 5th on 1916. They arrived at the lake, and Mimi and Toutou were making ready to go forth onto Lake Tanganyika. What is extraordinary in all of this is the secrecy which they hoped would prevail while they travelled across most of Central and Southern Africa, and certainly the Germans had their spies out, but it's remarkable that by the time they arrived at Lake Tanganyika at their supposed base, very little information had leaked about this enterprise, and it looked as though they would have the opportunity of surprise, which in most military scenarios is superb. Unloading Mimi and Toutou was a challenge. They wanted to make sure the hull wasn't damaged, and very carefully they were lifted from their carriages, slid down on a mud embankment and brought towards the lake, where they would eventually be hidden and slipped very quietly into the water. Commander Spicer Simpson set about this with some care, acclimatizing his men to the conditions and assembling them often on the waterfront to review the challenge ahead. Looking back at the way in which they fill these gullies, one can imagine the hundreds and thousands of rocks that must have been used, taken from the forest, and the destruction at the time must have been incredible. There were some boats on the lake, and they were also being tested at the same time as Mimi was being pulled through the mountains along with Toutou. And here we can see the kind of traction engines in action. These are remarkable machines, and in fact they exist today. There are several of them in Canada, quite a number in the UK and New Zealand and Australia, fully restored, and the exact same type that were used on this amazing expedition. Of course, the media were involved and featured tremendous photographs that came back by special dispatches from East Africa, especially when the men were unloading these wonderful boats from their carriages. And at that time, the brilliant German general von Vorbeck was eyeing his askaris, trying to figure out how he would lead them into battle, while the Brits were doing more or less the same with their troops. The odds were tremendous. The large German vessels were heavily armed, and they were protecting a considerable amount of trade across Lake Tanganyika. There was an extraordinary fleet on the lake at this time. All in all, 5 large, reasonably large boats with heavily armed escorts traveling from colony to colony. And while this was happening, our Mimi and Toutou crew were gradually figuring out how they would attack and create enough havoc to change the balance on the lakes. You can have some idea of the boats that were on Lake Tanganyika at the time, very large compared with our 2 little friends Mimi and Toutou, but also rather slow and not that maneuverable. At the time when they launched Mimi and Toutou, it was still shrouded in secrecy, but they pushed the boats into the mist, went into the center of the lake, did a little bit of target practice, managed to range their guns, and then they were ready for action. But so were the Kriegsmarine, and here you can see the German gunners pushing shells into the breach, but that was not very successful because Mimi and Toutou were able to outrun them and outgun them and managed to sink them. And here we can see some of the lake traffic that resulted because of that. And here we have 3 interesting book reviews that I think you'll enjoy. First, of course, is the wonderful book by Giles Foden, Mimi and Toutou, which describes this extraordinary enterprise, and you will find it is based on the story of the African Queen with Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. The next book I'm reviewing is the remarkable story of the Champagne Navy. This is about a group of Canadians who manned a series of gunboats in the English Channel during the Second World War, many of them members of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club in Toronto, amazingly heroic and incredibly effective against the German ships in the Channel. The final book is one of my favorites. It is a book by Adam Hochschild, and it's called King Leopold's Ghosts. It's the story of how King Leopold personally owned the Belgian Congo, what we know now as the Belgian Congo, and was instrumental in the extraordinary slave trade there. It's a story of how a small clerk in Furness Withy in Liverpool discovered the imbalance of trade, did some investigations, and discovered the horrific slaving that King Leopold was responsible for. It's an extraordinary story. It's a story of redemption, and it's a story of history that one really needs to understand. And finally, thank you for tuning in to Storytime for Grown-Ups. I'll leave you with this lovely model of Fifi and Toutou for you to reminisce about this tale. Thank you so much.